Get started here, and welcome everybody. My name is Ivan Elan. I'm the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming today to our program, The New International Arms Race in Space and How to Avoid It. We've got four prominent experts here to talk about this today, and I'm going to give a short introduction and then introduce them very briefly, and I'm going to be brief in the introductions because we want to get to the presentations as quickly as possible. And so I'll just start by saying that this is a great time to have this forum. The impetus behind it is because the Institute is publishing Mike Moore's book, Twilight War, The Folly of U.S. The Folly of U.S. Space Dominance. And it's a very important book, and it's a good time to discuss it because we've had several developments that are very important recently. The Chinese have tested an anti-satellite weapon. And of course, even more recently was the U.S. shoot down of the malfunctioning satellite, which seemed to show that missile defense capabilities may have some anti-satellite capabilities. We also have the Russian Chinese proposition to get a treaty on space weapons and the U.S. opposition to that. So today we're raising the question, is it in the U.S. interest to have an arms race in space? And if it is not, then how do we avoid that? Now, our distinguished panelists, which I'll introduce shortly, can of course say anything they want today, but I have one question that they might want to address during the proceedings. A space arms race seems to be a little different than the nuclear arms race during the Cold War, for the simple reason that in the nuclear arms race during the Cold War, the U.S. never really wanted to limit anything while it was still ahead. Now that seems to be the case in all arms races, or at least most of them. I can think of probably only one, maybe the Washington Treaty of 1921, the naval treaty, where that didn't happen. But usually the leader doesn't want to negotiate, and the country that's behind does want to negotiate limits. And of course, it is comparable to the political races where the front runner doesn't want to debate and the challenger wants to debate. But the difference in that sort of dynamic in the nuclear arms race, it seems to me, and I'm certainly no expert on this, it seems that the big difference in space as opposed to the nuclear arms race was that despite the U.S. lead in space weapons R&D and maybe even some capabilities in these space weapons, it seems that the U.S. also has the most to lose by an arms race in space. That is to say, it has the most commercial satellites and most non-weapon military satellites in space. Now that's just my layman's question, so I'd like to pose the question, aside from ideology, politics, or morality, is it practical and advantageous for the U.S. to start an arms race when it is so vulnerable to space weapons itself? In other words, wouldn't it be practical and advantageous for the U.S. to reverse opposition to the treaty banning or at least controlling space weapons? So I invite the panelists to comment on that question, but of course they don't have to stick with that question. They can say anything they want, as I mentioned. So I'm going to now introduce the speakers in order of their appearance, and they can just follow one another without my intercession after that. Our first speaker, who I guess is going to sort of give an overview of the issue, is Peter L. Hayes. He's the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Center for Space and Defense Studies. He's here on my left. The second speaker, very distinguished, Theresa Hitchens, is the director of the Center for Defense Information. Our third speaker is Jeff Kueter. He's the president of the George C. Marshall Institute. And our featured author today, who will speak last, is Mike Moore. He's the former editor of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and he's also a research fellow here at the Independent Institute. And of course, he is author of the book Twilight War, The Folly of U.S. Space Dominance. So that gave me a second opportunity to hold up the book on TV. So, okay, Peter, go ahead and start. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Mike and the Independent Institute. I really appreciate this opportunity to be here. And it's always a great pleasure for me to get out of the basement of the Pentagon and join you surface dwellers here, so I'm very glad to be here. I need to just highlight that nothing I say is in any official capacity. I'm a contractor with the government, so I couldn't possibly speak on behalf of the government, and I will not do so, of course. Mike asked me to talk a little bit about, for about 10 minutes, the growing importance of space. And one of the things that I think you will see throughout the four panelists is that even though we might disagree in many areas, I think all of us would really strongly concur with the fact that space is of growing importance, not only to the United States, but internationally as well. And it's not just state actors, but a variety of actors, to include individuals, are now empowered in ways that weren't possible just a few years ago. And that trend is accelerating, and we see no reason to expect that it wouldn't continue on. But in these short remarks, what I'll try and do is just concentrate on how space has become increasingly important for the United States military. Since I only have 10 minutes, that's what I'm going to focus on. I don't mean to imply that that's the only place where it's of growing importance, because, as I just said, that's not the case. But if I only have 10 minutes, that's where I'm going to focus. I'd like to take you back a little bit, and one of the things I really like about Mike's book is that he does a, I think, exceptional job of going through the history of what militaries do, what the U.S. military in particular does, what the U.S. Air Force did, say, in World War II. And back at that time, if you know, the Holy Grail was daylight, high-altitude precision bombardment. And we devoted all kinds of energy into trying to make that a reality. But the fact of the matter was, in World War II, in the European theater, the average bomb did not fall within 5 miles of its intended target. That ain't too good. So that requires then different types of strategies. You're going to probably have to do area bombing, burning down cities, for example, instead of trying to take out a ball bearing factory or some such nonsense. So one of the things, again, that I like about Mike's book is that it places all that into context. So what's really happened, and I think largely as a result of space, is that that world has completely changed, at least for the United States and increasingly for another or a number of other actors around the world. Precision, long-range precision, is increasingly the case for modern militaries. And let's try and operationalize that a little bit. I'm sure many of you remember the 1991 Gulf War. That was touted by the then Air Force Chief of Staff, Merrill McPeak, as the first space war. Why did he say that? Well, he said it because space enabled almost all U.S. and coalition military operations during that war back in 1991. And things have only gotten much better in that respect since that time forward. Just to give you a few specifics on that, at that time in 1991, the U.S. Global Positioning System, our navigation and timing satellites, that was not a completed constellation. They only had a partial constellation up there. But even with that partial capability and really a great lack of receivers that were dedicated to being able to use that system, the U.S. and coalition forces were still able to travel and navigate in trackless desert, do rendezvous, have precision timing, and even to a small degree use that to guide some precision munitions. But again, at that time, we didn't have the entire infrastructure in place to be able to do all those things. Likewise, how did we know that any of Saddam's Scuds were being targeted anywhere? That was from space. Our defense support program satellites were the first ones to see the infrared signature of those missile launches, and we kludged together a system that was able to provide warning, about 90-second warning, before those were going to come into theater. And that's another kind of example of how that system worked. The United States took an architecture that was designed to focus on the Soviet Union and strategic threats, and started applying it down at the tactical level for much smaller and lower level threats. So obviously when you do that, you have some difficulties kind of embedded in that and morphing the system over into something that's more useful for that type of operation. And the total number of precision-guided munitions in the 1991 Gulf War was only about 7%. And again, those weren't guided by GPS. They were mostly electro-optical guided. But in that case, you have to say what did space provide, and it's the targeting coordinates for those systems, and then doing battle damage assessment to see if, in fact, you struck what it is that you were aiming at. One of the other things that a lot of commentators remarked about in the first Gulf War is that instead of having large strike packages go in with dozens or maybe hundreds of aircraft required to penetrate enemy airspace and achieve the desired effect, in a lot of cases when you have stealth technology and the space-enabled technology, you can actually fly one plane in to do that same mission and have the same probability of achieving those effects. Let's move forward a little bit. In 1999, we had the NATO air campaign over Kosovo and Serbia. In this case, there was a pretty large increase in the amount of precision-guided munitions available and used by the NATO forces in this conflict, and predominantly by the United States. We saw the first use of the B-2 bomber in this operation, also the first use of the Joint Direct Attack Munition, which is a GPS-guided kit that fits onto conventional bombs. So those were all used to, I would say, pretty great effect. It was a rather long campaign, maybe longer than a lot of people wanted. It was about 70 days long. But at the end, Milosevic did comply with the demands of the NATO coalition, and there were no ground forces used in that war. So that's another kind of distinguishing effect. And finally, let me just briefly mention our latest unpleasantness in Iraq and Afghanistan. During those operations, we have almost a complete flip-flop between unguided and guided munitions. So whereas in 1991, only 7% of the munitions expended from air were from precision-guided kits, by 2003, the percentage was 70%. And that enables many, many different types of operations and smaller footprints, smaller numbers of people going into harm's way to accomplish those objectives. And also, I will just point out to you that even if you're on the receiving end of that, let's contrast that with what happened in Dresden, or even Grozny, for that matter. When you have the ability to precisely strike what it is that you're aiming at, is that for me? Oh, okay, all right. Then you're going to achieve a lot less collateral effects as well. So that could be very useful in that regard. Looking forward into the future, and I think one of the main topics that we're going to get into as a panel is, given that growth in the utility and use of space for the United States military, what would be the best path forward? And why shouldn't the United States at least consider trying to institutionalize or rationalize, maybe protect its capabilities when it comes to those space-enabled forces? And in my judgment, that is something the United States needs to look very carefully at. But as I'm sure we'll get into, there are a number of pretty difficult challenges associated with that. And I would just also highlight to you that there's been a number of efforts in this regard over time. The United States and the Soviet Union had 3 rounds of anti-satellite negotiations back in 1978 and 1979. And that achieved really nothing at all at the end of the day. The negotiators weren't even able to agree on what was a space weapon or other kind of key definitional issues. During the 1980s, part of the 3 baskets of strategic arms control included the defense and space talks. And of those 3 baskets, that was the only basket that didn't achieve an agreement. And in fact, there's really almost nothing you can point to in terms of a product out of that negotiating effort that went on for a number of years. So I highlight that to you because it's not the case that the United States and others haven't thought about this and haven't made at least some effort towards these ends. And certainly I'm sure others will talk about the ongoing effort at the Conference on Disarmament. It's been, I think, since, what, 82, that they've been looking to have some type of prevention of an arms race, PEROS, either treaty or some other instrument that would help to maybe stabilize things in this regime. But I do want to highlight that that's a lot easier said than done. And I think maybe in the subsequent discussions we can get into why that might be the case. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
I also want to thank Mike for inviting me and the Institute for putting this on today. This is an issue that I think is growing in importance, and it's something that the United States is really going to have to grapple with over the next decade, and it's going to be a very important issue. Pete left me a good segue because I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as an incipient arms race in space and what the drivers might be toward that, and kind of where we've come from. As Pete mentioned, back in the Cold War, there were efforts to negotiate some kind of cap or ban on anti-satellite weapons. At the same time, both the Soviet Union and the United States pursued anti-satellite capabilities. There were tests and in some cases brief deployments of systems, but they never quite fell over the brink. So they never really put in place programs, and even though they failed to reach negotiated settlements. So I think there are some historical lessons to be learned there and to be discussed. One of the reasons that they didn't fall over the brink was that both sides were very, very concerned about the impact anti-satellite weapons might have on crisis stability and the nuclear balance, because satellites were crucially important to each side knowing what the other's nuclear forces were up to. And there were clear concerns about protecting what then was called national technical means in order to have some transparency and some warning and not to get into a situation of accidental nuclear war. I'm going to say something at the end about how those dynamics may or may not have changed. Pete put his finger on what I think is the primary driver toward a renewed, if you will, arms race in space, and that is that the technology of space has come to be integrated so closely with tactical military operations. And not only here in the United States, but increasingly in other countries, in Europe and in Russia, and eventually in China. When you tie tactical military operations more closely with your space operations, you start to have to ask yourself the question, well, what's a fair target? What do I want to target? So that's probably the key driver. The reason that this has happened is because the technology has proliferated and it's become cheaper and easier for nations, and there are now more and more nations who are developing and deploying dual-use systems as well as strictly military systems. But you don't have to have a military satellite to gain military benefits from a satellite. So what we've seen in the recent past is in my opinion, evidence that we are moving to a kind of tipping point, perhaps, on this issue. And that is certainly the Chinese anti-satellite weapons test of January 2007. They destroyed one of their own satellites using essentially a modified ballistic missile. They became then the third nation after the Soviet Union and the United States to deliberately test anti-satellite weapons technologies. And then just recently we had the U.S. Navy doing what is known as a deliberate takedown. It really wasn't a shoot down because you don't shoot the thing. I mean, they smashed it in orbit. A spy satellite that was out of control. And while the rationale for that was public safety, the problem of not knowing where the satellite might fall, it's very clearly the case that demonstrated or re-demonstrated U.S. anti-satellite weapons capabilities. And that cannot be lost on the other nations of the world. So we have a situation now where in response to these two sort of bookends of activity, a number of other nations are now starting to consider their options. Certainly Moscow has got to be thinking about, well, do we now need to be the third nation to re-demonstrate our capabilities? President Putin has recently threatened to take retaliation if these kinds of tests continue. Another question is what happens in China. China was actually really surprised after their anti-satellite weapons test at how much negative political fallout came from that, and it prompted some rethinking in Beijing about what they actually really wanted to go ahead and do. And I'm very concerned that the recent U.S. action it is simply going to give ammunition to the hardliners in China who want to continue with an anti-satellite weapons development. You should remember that Russia and China for a very long time have suspected that the U.S. missile defense program was not about defense at all, but it was about developing an offensive space control program. And I personally don't believe that. I think the two things have different drivers, but using a missile defense asset to smash a satellite has got to pour fuel on that particular fire. Also, in recent days, after the U.S. move, India has apparently entered into a very serious internal debate. For a long time, the Indian Air Force has been pushing to get a strictly military space program, and for a long time they've failed. In the wake of the Chinese anti-satellite test, remembering that China is India's chief strategic rival in the region, the Air Force was making headway and had gotten approval to go forward with an aerospace command. The U.S. action prompted some remarks by the former president, Abdul Kalam, who stated that India could destroy satellites up to 200 kilometers, but that it needed better capability. And the argument here in India, which I think is an argument that may actually finally sway the Indian government, which has been sort of staving this off, is that they don't want to be in the same situation they were in with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as you may recall, the NPT was signed before India had been able to demonstrate a nuclear weapons capability, and therefore they were always considered a bad guy. They were outside the regime, they didn't want to sign, they saw it as discriminatory, and they wanted to catch up. There is now discussion that if there is going to be an anti-satellite weapons arms race, India needs to get its capabilities off the ground before anyone makes an effort to constrain them. So this could be a real change in Indian politics, because up to now they've been actually supportive of using diplomatic measures to constrain such an arm race, and this may change their minds. They may now push back in an effort to develop capabilities to prove that they are just as capable as China. And of course, where India goes, Pakistan will go. Pakistan is technically behind, but it has a ballistic missile program, and it could certainly, if it so chose, make efforts to catch up and to demonstrate capability. And lastly, we have Iran. The U.S. is already concerned about what Iran is up to with ballistic missiles in its space program. It would seem to me that the action that the U.S. took with regards to its failing satellite could serve as kind of a green light for Iran to undertake a similar test as long as they did it in a responsible way. And I will say that the U.S. was not irresponsible. That's not true. They gave notice of what they were going to do to allies, and they also made sure that the space debris threat from this action would be very minimal. So it's not that it was an irresponsible act in the same way that the Chinese anti-satellite test was, but you have to worry about what precedents are set. In my humble opinion, this could be a very bad thing if we do actually see ourselves enter into an anti-satellite arms race. And the reason is that what you're seeing demonstrated, these kinds of capabilities, these destructive capabilities using missiles or air-launched missiles or sea-launched missiles or ground-launched missiles, are actually one of the easier methods to destroy a satellite, and it's also a method that you are sure of kill because you can see the kill. And therefore, militaries tend to like things that they know have actually been effective. So there are drivers toward this particular type of weapon, easier to do in the short term, and you have a high probability of knowing. And the problem, of course, is that these types of weapons create massive amounts of orbital debris. The Chinese test created 2,000 plus pieces of space debris larger than a baseball, and at least 150,000 other pieces that are bigger than a marble, but big enough to kill a sat. But you can't track. So you can only track things down to about the size of a baseball. Anything smaller, it's very difficult to track and get out of the way of. The Chinese satellite was 1 ton, a 1-ton satellite, a small satellite. Most military and communications satellites are around 10 tons or maybe more. So bigger, a lot bigger. And when you smash a lot bigger satellite, you get a lot more space debris. And space is already polluted, particularly in the orbits that are most useful to human activities. So the specter of a shooting war in space ought to concern everyone who actually uses space, because space debris knows no nationality. It's indiscriminate. It can kill a commercial satellite just the same as one of your own. So it's not a very pretty picture when you start to think about a handful of 10-ton satellites being smashed up in a shooting war in space. And so it seems to me that given the fact that, as was mentioned by Ivan, that the United States is actually the most dependent on space, and we are the leading space power with the most satellites, that we would be the nation most concerned about this. And in fact, the US Air Force has long said that it doesn't like those types of weapons. It would really rather not go there. On the other hand, the US government has never been willing to close the option of going there. So in my own humble opinion, I think we've set ourselves into a strategic dilemma. Whereas our refusal to rule out these types of weapons is encouraging other people to pursue them, which is not in our interest. And that's something that really has to be discussed, I think, in detail, and it's going to really need to be addressed by the next administration, because other nations are moving, and we need to figure out what we're going to do about that. So I'm going to quit there.